Indianapolis, Indiana, August 22nd, 2023. Brian Walton, a 31-year-old marketing executive, was found dead at the bottom of the staircase in his home. What initially seemed like a tragic household accident soon raised suspicions, prompting a deeper investigation. What started as whispers of a troubled marriage soon unraveled into a case of calculated betrayal, one that would leave the community stunned. Nicole Walton barely had time to breathe, let alone think about where her life had gone wrong. Most mornings, she was out the door before sunrise, grabbing coffee on the way to her receptionist job at a small law firm in downtown Indianapolis. 8 hours of answering phones, filing paperwork, and handling impatient clients later, she would rush home just long enough to change clothes before heading to her second job, a night shift at a local diner, where the pay barely made up for the exhaustion. She spent more time in a cramped back office or behind a counter wiping down tables than she did in her own home. By the time she finally got back to their small apartment, it was usually past midnight. Brian was either asleep or out. Either way, the space felt empty. Their life together hadn't always been like this. When they first got married, Nicole had believed in Brian's ambition. He wasn't like the other guys she had dated. He was a dreamer, a man with plans for the future. He had convinced her that one day, all of their sacrifices would be worth it, that he would make something of himself. But after 5 years of marriage, Nicole was still waiting. Brian had cycled through more business ventures than she could count. First, it was real estate. He was sure he could make a fortune flipping houses, but when that didn't work out, he moved on to cryptocurrency. That phase lasted a year before he lost more than he made. Then, it was consulting, then stock trading, then some vague startup idea that never even got off the ground. Now, he had settled on insurance sales. This time, he swore, it was different. This time, he was going to make it. Nicole had stopped getting her hopes up. She was the one paying the rent. She was the one covering the bills, putting food on the table, and making sure they weren't drowning in debt. And Brian? He spent his days networking, making connections, scrolling through get-rich-quick schemes on his laptop while she worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. At first, she had been patient. She had supported him, encouraged him, and told herself that all successful people had to start somewhere. But years had passed, and Brian was still searching for his big break, while she was running herself into the ground. She could feel the resentment growing, creeping into the way she spoke to him, the way she looked at him when she came home exhausted and saw him sitting on the couch, barely looking up from his phone. She wasn't the only one who had changed. Brian had started pulling away too, but for different reasons. He felt like a failure. He wouldn't admit it out loud, but deep down, he knew Nicole saw him differently now. He could feel it in the way she sighed when she checked the bank account, the way she hesitated before handing him cash for groceries, the way she stopped asking about his work. It made him resent her. He was supposed to be the man of the house, the provider. But Nicole didn't need him. She just tolerated him. Then he met Victoria Norman. She was everything Nicole wasn't. Confident, powerful, a woman who took what she wanted and never apologized for it. Victoria was the regional director at the insurance firm where Brian had just started working, and she commanded respect everywhere she went. Unlike Nicole, she didn't look at him like he was a disappointment. She believed in him, told him he had potential. At first, it was just professional. She took an interest in his career, mentoring him, giving him advice, introducing him to the right clients. She even took him out to expensive dinners to discuss strategy, letting him see a glimpse of the life he had always wanted. And then, slowly, the lines blurred. Victoria started touching his arm when she laughed, leaning in just a little too close during meetings. And Brian didn't stop her. He liked the attention. For the first time in years, he felt important again. Meanwhile, Nicole was too busy keeping their life from falling apart to notice. She barely spoke to Brian anymore. Aside from the necessary small talk, did you pay the credit card bill? Did you pick up the groceries? Every interaction felt like a transaction, a task to check off a list. And Brian had stopped trying. He spent more time at work than necessary, stayed out later, told Nicole he was meeting with clients, when he was really sitting across from Victoria at a high-end restaurant, drinking expensive whiskey while she smiled at him like he was worth something. One night, Nicole came home from work and found him asleep on the couch. His phone was sitting on the coffee table, the screen lighting up with a new message. She wasn't the type to check his phone, but something about the way he had been acting distant lately made her pause. The message preview read, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow." Nicole stared at the screen. The number wasn't saved, but she already knew exactly who it was. She could have woken him up, demanded an explanation, looked through the rest of his messages to confirm what she already knew. But she didn't. Instead, she just turned away. She wasn't angry. Not yet. What she felt was something far worse. Brian had once promised her a future. Now, he was throwing it all away for a woman who already had everything. The next morning, Brian left for work like nothing had changed. He kissed her on the cheek, grabbed his bag, and told her he'd be home late. Something about a business dinner. Nicole forced herself to smile. And as she watched him walk out the door, she realized for the first time in their marriage, she didn't care if he ever came back. Brian Walton didn't plan to cheat. That's what he told himself, anyway. It wasn't like he had gone looking for it. He wasn't the kind of guy who threw away his marriage for a thrill. But the more time he spent around Victoria Norman, the easier it became to justify what was happening. It started out innocent enough: business conversations, career advice, and late nights at the office where she helped him refine his approach. She called him ambitious, told him he had a sharp mind, said he had something special. No one had said that to him in years. At home, all he ever got from Nicole was sighs and stress. She was always exhausted, always working, always reminding him that the bills weren't going to pay themselves. Victoria was different. The first dinner invitation came a few weeks after he started at the company. She had pulled him aside after a team meeting and casually suggested they go over sales strategies somewhere outside the office. Brian hesitated for half a second before agreeing. It was just dinner. He was just networking. When he arrived at the restaurant, he realized how wrong he was. Victoria had chosen one of the most expensive steakhouses in the city, the kind of place where people like him didn't go unless they were celebrating something big. She was already waiting at a private table in the back, a bottle of wine chilling beside her. "This one's on me," she said, pouring him a glass. "You work hard, Brian. You deserve a little reward." She said it so smoothly, so matter-of-factly, that he didn't even question it. The night blurred after that. The conversation wasn't just about business anymore. They talked about ambition, about the kind of success that took real sacrifice. Victoria leaned in when she spoke. Her eyes locked onto his like she was seeing something no one else had ever noticed. It made Brian feel like he mattered, like he was meant for something bigger than barely scraping by. By the time the check came, he wasn't thinking about Nicole at all. Victoria didn't stop there. She started inviting him to more places: client meetings at high-end bars, private networking events where people with real money talked about things he barely understood. She bought him drinks without hesitation, picked up tabs like they were nothing. Then came the gifts: a leather watch, a custom-tailored suit. At first, he refused, telling her he couldn't accept anything like that. She just laughed and waved it off. "Consider it an investment," she said. Brian didn't argue after that. For the first time in years, he felt like someone. At home, Nicole barely had time to notice the changes. She was too busy keeping their life from falling apart, too exhausted from working 2 jobs to see what was happening right in front of her. But as the weeks passed, the cracks in their marriage widened. Brian started dressing better, wearing cologne again, spending more time looking at himself in the mirror before he left the house. He came home late, muttering something about long meetings or networking events, brushing off Nicole's questions like they were beneath him. She didn't want to be suspicious. She was too tired to be suspicious. But then, one night, she walked into the kitchen and found him near the window, his phone pressed to his ear. He was speaking in a low voice, the kind of tone someone used when they didn't want to be overheard. The second he saw her, he ended the call. "Who was that?" she asked, drying her hands on a dish towel. Brian didn't even blink. "Work stuff. At 11 o'clock at night?" He sighed and rolled his eyes, like she was being ridiculous. "Jesus, Jess. Can I have a private conversation without you acting like a cop?" She didn't say anything else, just turned back to the sink and let the silence settle between them. It was easier to ignore it, but the little things kept piling up. Brian's phone was always in his hand now. If she reached for it, even just to check the time, He grabbed it back like it was something dangerous. His messages were suddenly locked, his notifications turned off. When she finally confronted him about it, he laughed. "You're imagining things. You've been working too much, you're exhausted. You need to stop stressing so much." If she pushed harder, he turned it on her. "You don't even trust me anymore. You've changed, Jess. You're always looking for a fight." It was easier to let him win. She was too tired to argue. But other people started noticing, too. One morning, after an exhausting double shift, Nicole ran into her neighbor Melissa while grabbing the mail. Melissa hesitated before speaking. "Is Brian doing okay?" Nicole frowned. "What do you mean?" Melissa shifted awkwardly. "I don't know. He just seems different. I saw him downtown the other night. He was at that new place on 6th. Looked like he was having a good time." Nicole's stomach twisted. Brian had told her he was working late. That night, she watched him more closely. The way he smirked at his phone. The way he barely looked at her when she walked into the room. For the first time, she knew she wasn't imagining things. Nicole Walton had always been willing to make sacrifices. She had taken on extra shifts, worked late nights, and pushed through exhaustion, all because she believed in the future she and Brian had planned together. She had trusted that one day, his ambitions would amount to something real, that all the years of struggle would lead to stability, to a better life. But now, something was different. It wasn't just the distance between them. That had been growing for a while. It was the subtle shifts in Brian's behavior that made her uneasy. He had always been careless with his appearance, wearing the same worn-out button-downs, the same scuffed shoes. But lately, he had been dressing better, too well for a man who claimed to be struggling to build his career. He ironed his shirts, shined his shoes, and checked his reflection in the mirror before heading out the door. He had started wearing cologne again, something he hadn't bothered with in years. At first, Nicole told herself it was a good thing. Maybe he was finally taking his job seriously. Maybe he had grown tired of failing and was making an effort. She wanted to believe that. But deep down, she knew better. Then there was his phone. Brian had never been secretive before. He used to leave his phone lying around the apartment, answering messages whenever he got to them. Now, it was always in his hand. If he wasn't checking it, it was in his pocket, screen locked. If she happened to reach for it, he grabbed it back with almost frantic urgency. One night, after a late shift at the diner, Nicole came home to find Brian sitting near the window, speaking into his phone in a hushed voice. He was leaning against the frame, watching the street below. The moment he saw her, he ended the call and locked the screen without hesitation. Nicole stood there for a moment, watching him. He looked different somehow, more put together, more confident, the way he had been lately. The kind of confidence that didn't come from struggling to make ends meet. She knew then that something was wrong. The confirmation came a few days later. She had been doing laundry, mindlessly going through the motions, when she reached into the pocket of Brian's jeans and pulled out something small and crumpled. Her fingers tightened around it as she realized what it was. A condom wrapper. Her body stiffened. She hadn't seen Brian touch her in weeks, maybe months. Their marriage had turned into quiet routines and exhausted silences. So why would he have this? Her heart pounded as she yanked open the drawer of his nightstand. Inside, she found a partially used pack of condoms. She didn't even remember the last time they had used one. Nicole sat down on the edge of the bed, the room suddenly feeling too small, too stifling. She stared at the evidence in her hands, her mind racing through every possibility, every excuse she could come up with. None of them made sense. She put everything back exactly as she found it and closed the drawer. She didn't confront him that night. She didn't say anything at all. She simply watched. The next morning, Brian casually mentioned that he would be leaving for a work trip. Nicole barely reacted, stirring her coffee as he spoke. "I'll be gone a few days," he said, stuffing clothes into a small suitcase. "Company's sending me to meet some clients." She nodded. "Where?" "Chicago." She watched as he continued packing, choosing clothes far too nice for a business trip. He had packed like he was going on vacation. Nicole stayed quiet, observing, waiting. Later that evening, she reached for Brian's phone, intending to check the time, and saw that his entire call history was wiped. His text messages were gone too. Brian had never deleted messages before. Not once in the years they had been together. But now? Now there was nothing. Nicole's stomach twisted. She felt a sharp, sickening certainty settle over her. She needed proof. A few days later, after finishing a long shift, she ran into Lisa, one of her co-workers, outside the diner. Lisa hesitated before speaking, her tone cautious. "Hey, I didn't know you and Brian were celebrating something." Nicole frowned. "What do you mean?" "I saw him downtown the other night," Lisa said. "He was at that new steakhouse on 6th. Looked like he was having a good time." Nicole forced a smile. "Oh, yeah. He was probably just entertaining a client." Lisa gave a small nod, clearly uncomfortable. "He was with some older woman. Thought maybe it was his boss." Nicole felt her stomach drop, but she kept her expression neutral. She didn't ask any more questions. She just walked away. She went home and waited. That night, Brian walked through the door as if nothing had changed. He smiled, kissed her on the cheek, and set his keys on the counter, as if he wasn't lying to her every second of the day. Nicole had spent years sacrificing for him, waiting for him to live up to the promises he had made. She had exhausted herself working 2 jobs, coming home at midnight, barely getting enough sleep. Also, he could chase dreams that never amounted to anything. And now, after all that, he was throwing it all away. Something inside her shifted. She didn't yell. She didn't scream. She just looked at him, really looked at him, and saw him for what he was. For the first time, Brian wasn't her husband anymore. He was a burden. Nicole Walton had spent the past few months drowning in exhaustion, stress, and doubt. She had sacrificed so much to keep their lives afloat, working long hours at both jobs, barely getting any sleep, while Brian continued living in his fantasy of chasing success. He was supposed to be building a career. That was the excuse, the justification she had told herself over and over again. But lately, something had shifted. Brian had changed. Not in the way she had hoped. Not in a way that suggested he was finally stepping up to take responsibility. No, this change felt different. Colder. At first, it had been easy to brush off. His sudden new interest in personal grooming, the way he paid extra attention to his clothes, his hair, the cologne she never bought him. He had always been comfortable in wrinkled shirts and cheap cologne before, but now? Now, he cared. Then came the phone. Brian had never been secretive with his phone before. He would leave it out in the open, answer calls without a second thought, let her scroll through to check the weather or search for something. But now, it was always with him. Always locked, always hidden. If it was on the counter, he grabbed it the second she walked into the room. Nicole had tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself she was imagining things. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe she was reading too much into nothing. Then she found the hair. It was a Sunday afternoon, and she had just gotten home from an exhausting double shift. Brian wasn't home. No note, no text, no explanation. Just gone. The apartment was quiet, the air thick with the kind of silence that had become normal between them. She moved through the motions of her routine, tidying up the kitchen, sorting through laundry. She pulled his dress pants from the hamper, shaking them out before tossing them into the machine. That's when she saw it. A single, long blonde hair clinging to the fabric. Nicole froze. Her own hair was short, dark brown. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't hers. Her heart pounded as she stared at it, her fingers tightening around the fabric. It was like her body knew what it meant before her mind could process it. For a long time, she just stood there, gripping the pants, the sound of the washing machine humming in the background. This was it. Not suspicion. Not paranoia. This was proof. She felt lightheaded, like the air had been sucked from the room. Her hands trembled as she plucked the hair from the fabric, turning it between her fingers like she needed to convince herself it was real. But it was real. Nicole sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the strand in her hand. She had suspected for weeks, but now? Now there was no doubt. Brian was cheating on her, and he wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat there, her body rigid, her thoughts running in 1,000 different directions. She put everything back exactly as she found it. She didn't text him, didn't call him. She just waited. When Brian finally walked through the door that evening, Nicole was sitting on the couch, calm, composed. She held up the hair. "What is this?" Brian barely glanced at it. "What?" "This. On your pants." He scoffed, dropping his keys onto the counter. "Nicole, it's hair. What are you even talking about?" Her grip on the strand tightened. "It's blonde." Brian sighed, rubbing his face like he was exhausted from the conversation. "Oh my God. Seriously?" He shook his head, laughing under his breath like she had accused him of something ridiculous. "Jess, I work in an office. I'm around people. Maybe I brushed past someone. Maybe it's from a chair. You're losing your mind over a hair?" The way he said it, so dismissive, so casual, sent a wave of rage through her. Nicole felt something snap inside her. This wasn't the man she had married. The man she married used to look at her like she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. He used to be grateful for her, for everything she did. He used to see her. Now, he barely even looked at her. She dropped the hair onto the coffee table and stood up. "I'm done talking about this," she said, walking away before she did something she'd regret. Brian called after her, muttering something about her needing to relax, but she ignored him. She knew what was happening now. She just needed proof. The next few days, Nicole watched him. Brian had gotten careless. He smiled at his phone more than he ever smiled at her. He left the apartment late, dressed like he had somewhere important to be. He came home at odd hours, his shirt smelling like perfume, but never hers. And when he looked at her, there was nothing there. No guilt, no remorse. Just a man who had already moved on. Nicole didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just waited. Meanwhile, Brian had no idea that the woman he was betraying was memorizing his every move. At work, he bragged to Victoria about how he had handled Nicole, how she was so overworked and exhausted that she barely had time to think. "She buys every excuse I throw at her," he told her over drinks. "It's almost too easy." Victoria smirked, running a perfectly manicured finger down his arm. "Poor thing. Must be exhausting, juggling two women." Brian leaned back in his chair, grinning. "Not really. One of them does whatever I say." He had no idea how wrong he was. Nicole Walton had reached her breaking point. The past few months had drained her of every ounce of patience, leaving her feeling like a shell of the woman she once was. She had sacrificed so much for Brian, working herself into exhaustion while he continued living in his fantasy of chasing success. She had believed in him, believed in the life they had built together, and for what? So he could humiliate her? So he could throw it all away for an affair with a woman who had never known struggle? He had betrayed her, and worse, he wasn't even sorry. She saw it in the way he walked around the apartment, his presence barely registering her existence. He carried himself like a man who had already moved on, who no longer needed to make up excuses. The lies had stopped because he no longer felt he had to lie. He thought she was too exhausted, too naive, too dependent on him to do anything about it. He thought he had one. But Brian had underestimated her. The first time she thought about something terrible, she dismissed it as just an intrusive thought born out of anger. She wasn't that kind of person. She wasn't someone who did things like that. But as the days passed, as Brian continued to flaunt his affair, as he continued to come home late smelling like another woman's perfume, as he smirked at his phone when he thought she wasn't looking, the thought didn't go away. It grew. It took root. It became something she could no longer ignore. She started researching, nothing too suspicious at first, just general reading. Accidental deaths, how common they were, how many people died from simple household falls. Then she dug deeper, searching for information on fatal stairway accidents, reading about how a misplaced step, a slip, a sudden push at the right moment could be deadly. People fell down stairs all the time. No one questioned it. The idea of making it look like an accident intrigued her. A fall could be lethal, especially if the person hit their head just right. A single moment of imbalance, a shove at the perfect angle, Brian wouldn't know what hit him. She studied past cases, took mental notes on the details that made an accident look believable. The more she read, the more she convinced herself that this wasn't just an option. It was the solution. Her chance came sooner than she expected. Brian had grown more reckless with Victoria, spending more time with her, barely even pretending to care about hiding it. One evening, Nicole overheard him on the phone, his voice low, smug, full of arrogance. "Relax, baby," he had said. "I told you. I'm handling it." Nicole had stood outside the bedroom door, gripping the frame so tightly her fingers ached. Handling it. That was what he thought this was. A problem to be handled. The next morning, Brian left without a word, off to wherever he spent his time when he wasn't pretending to still be part of their marriage. Nicole spent the day going through the plan in her head, refining the details, imagining how it would play out. She pictured the angle, the force, the way his body would tumble down the stairs. She knew his habits well enough to predict exactly when and where to do it. She could already see it, Brian lying motionless at the bottom of the staircase, a tragic accident. No one would suspect a thing. That evening, he came home late again, reeking of liquor and perfume, looking as though he had just had the best night of his life. Nicole stood in the kitchen, watching him from the corner of her eye as she stirred a pot of pasta. Her mind was no longer clouded with uncertainty. She had made her decision. The following afternoon, Brian met Victoria for lunch at an upscale restaurant. She was growing impatient with him. "I'm not going to wait forever," she told him, sipping her wine with an air of entitlement. "You said you'd take care of this." Brian sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I will." Victoria narrowed her eyes. "Then when?" "She's still in the picture." "I don't share, Brian." He chuckled, waving her off. "Relax. I'm handling it." But even as he said the words, he knew he was out of time. That evening, he made his decision. Nicole was in the kitchen when he walked in, tossing his keys onto the counter without a glance in her direction. He exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "We need to talk." She turned to face him, arms crossed. "What is it?" He met her gaze with feigned sympathy, though the detachment in his eyes was unmistakable. "I'm filing for divorce." Nicole didn't move. "I've been thinking about this for a long time," he continued, as if it were some thoughtful, rational decision. "This isn't working anymore. You know that." His voice was calm, rehearsed, like he had already convinced himself that this conversation was just a formality. "We'll split everything fairly," he added, as if he was being generous. "But you should probably move out soon." Something inside Nicole snapped. "Move out?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Brian sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You can't afford this place on your own." The words hit harder than anything he had ever said to her before. All those nights she had worked double shifts, all the exhaustion, all the sacrifices, and he was telling her she couldn't afford to keep the home she had paid for. He had been living off her for years, using her money to support his lifestyle, to chase his ridiculous dreams, and now he was tossing her aside like she was nothing. Nicole forced herself to nod. "Okay." Brian looked surprised at how easily she accepted it. He had expected a fight, expected her to cry, to beg, to make this difficult. But Nicole just turned back to the stove, stirring the pasta as if the conversation had never happened. He shrugged, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and sank onto the couch, turning on the TV without a care in the world. Nicole stood there, gripping the wooden spoon so tightly her knuckles turned white. The anger inside her wasn't explosive. It wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, controlled. Brian had given her an ending. Now, she just had to make it happen. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying it over in her mind. The moment, the fall, the silence that would follow. She had tested the railing earlier that day, knew exactly how much force she would need. Nicole Walton sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open, the soft glow of the screen casting faint shadows across her tired face. The search results staring back at her were clinical, straightforward, void of emotion. Common household accidents, fatal stairway falls, head trauma from falls, the probability of a fatal impact from a short distance. It was just research, nothing more. People fell down the stairs all the time. An unfortunate slip, a bad landing, and it was over in an instant. Some people survived, some didn't. That was just how things worked. It was no different than reading about car accidents or workplace injuries. Just information. Just knowledge. But something about the way her fingers lingered on the keyboard, the way her mind carefully absorbed each detail, felt different. Her heartbeat was steady, her breathing controlled, but something inside her was shifting. She wasn't just curious, she was calculating. She clicked on another article, reading about how a simple loss of balance could turn deadly, how a hard surface could be as lethal as any weapon. A staircase was a place of transition, a structure designed to move from one level to another, and yet it could just as easily be a trap. If someone were to fall at just the right angle, if their head hit the railing or the floor in just the right way, there would be little hope of survival. She swallowed hard, shutting the laptop as the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Brian walked into the kitchen, his usual arrogance filling the space before he even spoke. He reached into the fridge, pulling out a beer, his eyes barely flicking toward her. "What are you so focused on?" he muttered, twisting the cap off with one hand. Nicole's muscles tightened for just a second before she forced a casual shrug. "Just reading," Brian chuckled, taking a sip before shaking his head. "Didn't take you for the reading type." His words dripped with condescension, and Nicole bit the inside of her cheek to keep herself from reacting. It wasn't worth it. He wasn't worth it. He had spent months treating her like she was invisible, like she was some burden he had to deal with until he found something better. Maybe he already had. Later that evening, after Brian had sprawled across the couch, mindlessly scrolling on his phone, Nicole wandered toward the staircase. The apartment was silent except for the occasional sound of Brian chuckling at something on his screen, completely engrossed in his own world. Nicole stood at the top of the stairs, staring down at the narrow steps, her hand lightly resting on the wooden railing. It was solid, sturdy, but the human body wasn't. She imagined how easily someone could slip, how quickly it could be over. A misplaced step, an unfortunate moment of imbalance, a single second of miscalculation, and there would be no coming back. She shifted slightly, testing the rug beneath her feet, wondering if something as simple as a slightly folded edge could contribute to an accident. Just as she knelt down, the sudden sound of the doorbell sent a jolt through her body. Her pulse spiked, her breath catching in her throat as she turned sharply toward the entrance. For a brief second, irrational fear overtook her, the sensation of being caught doing something she shouldn't, even though she had done nothing at all. She inhaled deeply, forcing herself to push away the paranoia before heading to the door. A neighbor stood outside, holding a small stack of envelopes. "Hey, sorry to bother you, but I think these got mixed in with our mail." Nicole blinked before forcing a polite smile. "Oh, thanks. Happens all the time." The neighbor lingered, making small talk about the building's heating issues, the unreliable management, the noisy upstairs tenants. Nicole responded when needed, nodding, throwing in the occasional agreement, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept thinking about how quickly her entire demeanor had shifted, how uneasy she had felt the moment the doorbell rang. Was it guilt? Was it fear? Was it simply because she had been too deep in thought? When she finally closed the door, she let out a slow breath, pressing her back against the wood for a moment, grounding herself. She needed air. She needed to get out of the apartment. Grabbing her keys, she stepped outside and slid into her car, the night air crisp but doing little to settle her nerves. She drove without direction, the city lights blurring as she replayed the events of the past few months in her mind. Brian had checked out of their marriage long before she had ever let herself admit it. He had abandoned her emotionally, financially, in every way that mattered. And now, he was preparing to leave her completely. The thought sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through her veins. He had built his entire existence on her sacrifices, on her exhaustion, and now he was ready to throw her away like she was nothing. She barely noticed the red light until the blaring sound of a car horn ripped her out of her thoughts. Her body jerked forward as she slammed on the brakes, her heart hammering against her ribs. The other car sped past, its driver shouting something she couldn't hear, but she barely processed any of it. Her hands were shaking. She sat there for a long moment, gripping the wheel, breathing heavily. She had to get control of herself. After what felt like forever, she pulled into a parking lot and just sat there, staring ahead. She thought about turning back, about going home, about pretending that everything was normal. But nothing had been normal for a long time. By the time she returned home, Brian was exactly where she had left him, sprawled on the couch, phone in hand, completely disconnected from the world around him. He didn't even glance at her as she walked in, his focus entirely on whatever conversation he was having. His lips curled into a smirk, his fingers moving across the screen. Nicole didn't have to guess who he was texting. Then, without even looking up, he let out a small chuckle. Victoria actually supports me, you know? Nicole stopped mid-step, her entire body locking into place. Brian leaned back, stretching, his smirk growing. She believes in me. Unlike you. Something inside her shifted. She walked past him, up the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, her fingers curling into fists. Every second she had spent supporting him, every sleepless night, every moment of sacrifice. It had all been for nothing. Brian had never been grateful. He had never loved her the way she had loved him. Nicole Walton moved through the day as if nothing had changed. She went through the motions, pouring coffee, staring blankly at her phone, letting the television drone in the background. It was all mechanical, every movement feeling rehearsed, every breath controlled. She had already made her decision, and now she was simply waiting for the moment to arrive. Brian had left early that morning without a word, probably with Victoria, probably enjoying whatever illusion of power and success he thought he had. He had been growing bolder in recent weeks, more dismissive, barely even bothering to make excuses anymore. It was as if he had already moved on, as if Nicole no longer existed in his mind. That was fine. By the end of the night, he wouldn't exist in hers either. She spent the afternoon in a haze, her thoughts running on a loop, rehearsing the moment over and over. The plan was simple. It had to look like an accident, a slip, a loss of balance, a moment of miscalculation. It happened all the time. If she did it right, no one would question it. She had thought of everything, the angle, the force, the timing. She had even considered what she would say, how she would react. Shock, panic, grief. She needed to be convincing. As evening fell, the apartment was quiet, still. Nicole stood by the window, watching the street below, her fingers tapping absently against her arm. Any minute now, Brian would walk through the door, completely unaware of what was coming. She had spent so much time resenting him, so much time feeling trapped in this life he had built on her sacrifices. Tonight, it ended. Tonight, she took back control. The sound of the door unlocking sent a jolt through her body. She turned just as Brian stepped inside, tossing his keys onto the counter. His face was illuminated by the glow of his phone screen, his attention fixed on whatever conversation he was having. His lips curled into a slight smirk, completely detached from the reality around him. "Where were you?" Nicole's voice was calm, controlled. Brian didn't even glance up. "Out." "With who?" His smirk widened as he typed something, then finally locked his phone and looked at her. "What does it matter?" Nicole inhaled deeply, her fingers pressing against the cool surface of the counter. Brian let out a dramatic sigh, shaking his head like she was some ridiculous child throwing a tantrum. "I'm done pretending. You wanted the truth? Fine. I've moved on, Jess. Victoria's better for me. She actually supports me. You never did." Nicole felt her pulse slow, her breath steady. She had no reaction, none that he could see. She simply watched him, her expression unreadable. Brian mistook her silence for submission, just like he always had. He scoffed, shaking his head as he turned toward the stairs. She followed him, her steps light, calculated. Brian took the stairs slowly, one hand lazily gripping the banister. His posture was relaxed, his mind already elsewhere. That was the thing about Brian. He always assumed he was one step ahead of everyone else. He never saw it coming when someone had the upper hand. Nicole reached out and pushed him. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't hesitation. It was forceful, deliberate. Brian's body lurched forward, his footing slipping. His hands reached out instinctively, trying to steady himself, but there was nothing to hold on to. The moment stretched, suspended in time, before his body tumbled downward. The noise that followed was unmistakable, a sudden commotion, a disruption in the stillness of the apartment. And then, Silence. Nicole stood at the top of the stairs, frozen. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, had rehearsed every possible outcome, but nothing had prepared her for the crushing weight that now settled in her chest. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Her knees buckled, and she stumbled back, her hands gripping at her hair as if trying to steady herself. Her back hit the wall, and she slid down, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. This wasn't supposed to feel like this. She was supposed to feel relief, victory, satisfaction, but all she felt was a heavy, suffocating pressure closing in around her. Brian wasn't moving. The realization sent a fresh wave of panic crashing over her. Her hands trembled as she pressed them over her mouth, trying to contain the sobs that threatened to escape. She rocked forward slightly, her forehead pressing against her knees, her mind spiraling too fast to grasp onto any single thought. This was real. This wasn't a fantasy, wasn't an imagined moment of revenge playing out in her mind. Brian was gone. There was no undoing this. Nicole forced herself to look up, her tear-filled eyes locking onto the bottom of the staircase. The stillness of the scene made her stomach twist. The apartment was quiet, oppressively so. The kind of quiet that settled over a place when something irreversible had just happened. For a long moment, she couldn't move. She just sat there, the sound of her own breathing deafening in the silence. And then, slowly, she shifted. She needed to think. She needed to act. This was part of the plan. She had known this would happen. She had prepared for this. Nicole wiped at her face, inhaling sharply. She had to call 911. She had to sound shocked. She had to sound like a grieving wife, like someone who had just discovered a horrible accident. Her fingers hovered over the phone, her mind already piecing together the words she would say. She would cry. She would panic. She would tell them she found him like this, that she had no idea what had happened. She would be convincing. Taking a deep breath, she steadied herself. Her hands still trembled, but she forced them to move, forcing herself to dial. The line rang, and for a brief moment, she thought about hanging up, about running, about disappearing into the night and never looking back. But then the voice on the other end answered. Nicole exhaled shakily, closing her eyes. And then, she screamed. The hours that followed blurred together. Flashing lights, hurried footsteps, voices asking the same questions over and over. Nicole clung to her role, shaking, sobbing, letting every ounce of panic spill out as paramedics confirmed what she already knew. Officers moved through the apartment, taking notes, snapping photos, marking off the staircase with caution tape. She wrapped herself in a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, staring at nothing, answering only when spoken to. He fell. I don't know what happened. I just found him like that. Nicole Walton was taken to the station for routine questioning, still playing the part of the distraught widow. She stuck to her story. She had been upstairs when she heard the fall. She had run down to find Brian at the bottom of the staircase, and she had called 911 immediately. Investigators took notes, nodding along, but something about her behavior raised quiet suspicions. The medical examiner's report only added to those doubts. The pattern of Brian's injuries didn't fully match a typical fall. His body position suggested a forceful impact, rather than an accidental misstep. There were no defensive wounds, no signs he had tried to catch himself. The inconsistencies led authorities to dig deeper. Over the next several days, detectives uncovered cracks in Nicole's carefully crafted story. Witnesses, friends, co-workers, even neighbors, described a strained marriage, financial struggles, and Brian's well-known affair with Victoria Norman. Some had even heard the arguments in the weeks leading up to his death. Text messages from Nicole's phone revealed searches about stairway falls and fatal injuries, evidence that investigators couldn't ignore. A week after Brian's death, authorities took a closer look at the circumstances surrounding the incident, leading to Nicole's arrest and formal charges. Prosecutors argued that she had acted out of long-simmering resentment and financial desperation, making a split-second decision that ended her husband's life. During trial, the defense tried to paint the incident as an accident, but the forensic evidence was damning. Nicole was convicted and sentenced to 18 years in prison. Brian's affair with Victoria never amounted to much after his death. She distanced herself, denying any deep involvement, and eventually moved on. Nicole, once a woman who had given everything to support her husband, now spent her days behind bars, a cautionary tale of love, betrayal, and a decision made in a moment of rage that could never be undone.